no. This is not Ignite, so the slides do not auto-advance. You just, you don't even have to have slides. If you don't want to do slides, you can come up here, and we'll just hand you a microphone. You can run your mouth for 5 minutes. That's also an option. So whatever you want to do. If you want to stand on your head, that'd be fine as well. Let's see. So after that, we're actually, I think we have at least a 1 or 2 week gap where we don't have a speaker booked yet. So, you know, that's about what, it's 2 weeks away. We need a speaker. Coming down to the dire straits here. I have faith. I have faith in the community, guys, because we've never missed a week so far. So I know somebody out there, one of you, intrepid individuals, is going to step forward, perhaps today even, and volunteer. So that's about it. August is wide open. If July scares you, feel like that's too soon, also have August wide open. So yeah, want to give a shout out to our wonderful sponsors here. All these folks make what is in your plate possible today. And much more. So I want to give a shout out to all of these people. Any other, do we have any community announcements? Anybody running a meetup that needs to recruit or give a shout out? No? Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and get this show on the road. We have Aram here going to give us a talk about cryptography. So everybody give it up.
Okay. Weird. So yes, my name's Aram Perez. I just moved here about 3 months ago. Long story, but you know, trying to get myself established here. You know, this is going to be a very brief overview of cryptography. It's sort of a Reader's Digest version of a Reader's Digest version on cryptography. So let's begin. Yep. So. Okay, anybody recognize any of these people? Which one? You. Oh, me. Yeah. It's one of the downfalls of being tall is okay, anybody know who this guy is? Anybody ever heard of RSA? That's the R of RSA. This guy here? No. That's the D of Diffie-Hellman. That's Whitfield Diffie. And this guy here, that's Martin Hellman. So these two guys are the ones that started what's now known as public key cryptography. And this was an event earlier this year talking about these standards. I used to work for RSA Data Security, and there's a standard called PKCS number 11 that defines a crypto API. If you use Firefox, that's what they use for all their crypto. So I was the editor for the first version. So here's an overview of what I'm going to be talking today. First, I'm going to, what I won't cover. Define some cryptographic terms, a little bit of the history of cryptography, talk about encryption and decryption, some of the characteristics of the algorithms, talk about digital signatures and certificates, a very high overview of the different types of attacks, and leave you with some do's and don'ts, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. I have one slide on references and then a little bit on background. As I was putting this together, the deck just kept growing and growing, so that's why I put those at the end. If you have to leave, I know a lot of people have to get back at 1, feel free. I'll hang around, if you have questions, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. So I'm not going to talk about the politics of cryptography. I'm sure most of you heard about recently FBI was trying to force Apple to help them break an iPhone. There's also patents that if you use certain types of cryptography, you have to be aware. I'm not going to talk about bitcoins or blockchaining, which is sort of a new thing that's recently become quite popular. I'm just scratching the surface of cryptography, and I'm not going to talk about XML. There's one slide there. Other than tell you whoever invented XML should be killed, but okay, so let's talk about cryptographic terms. Cryptology is the science of secure communications, and it's generally divided into 2 portions. Cryptography, which is designing algorithms for secure communications, and in English, cryptography and cryptology are interchangeably. You rarely hear cryptology. And then cryptanalysis is basically breaking cryptography. So secure communications, is the exchange of messages where only the authorized parties can have access to the real message. Cryptographers like to use Alice and Bob. They are the 2 authorized parties that are trying to communicate. There's Eve, who's trying to eavesdrop on their communication. There's a guy, I call him Manny. This is my own personal name. But basically, he's a guy in the middle, and he tries to actively participate and fool Alice and Bob that they're talking to each other. Encryption is basically a mechanism to provide message confidentiality. So that means only the person that has the key can decrypt and understand the message. Otherwise, you just get garbage. So you encrypt to scramble the message and decrypt to unscramble the message. Plain text is the unscrambled message, basically the original message. Ciphertext is after it's been encrypted. Then we have what's called message authentication, is to ensure that the message was sent by who you think sent it. And message integrity is a mechanism to ensure that while it was in transit, it didn't get modified. A digital signature is a mechanism that is designed to provide both authentication and integrity of a message or data. Steganography is the science of hiding information in plain sight. Most popular type is hiding information in a JPEG. So you can embed information there. Someone looking at the JPEG won't know there's a hidden message in there. A common fallacy or belief is what I call here security through obscurity. A lot of people believe this gives them security. Please don't fall for that. There was a Dutch cryptographer came out with this principle back in the 1800s. Basically says the security of a secure communication system should depend only on the secrecy of the key and not the secrecy of the algorithms used. So you assume that everything about the algorithm is known, and the only thing you have to protect is the key. A cipher is just another name for an algorithm. A term you'll hear a lot is called PKI, or public key infrastructure. It's basically supposedly a system to support public key cryptography. One of my pet peeves is no one talks about an SKI, or secret key infrastructure. If you have, if you're using encryption, you have to have some sort of infrastructure to support it. It doesn't matter whether it's public key or secret key. A certificate authority is a trusted third party that provides trusted keys, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. A hash is basically a fixed size representation of a message. It's generally shorter than the message. It's also known as a digest or a fingerprint. When you're using it in cryptography, you have to have the hash function has to meet these three things. One, given a hash value, you can't go back and determine what the message was. Two, any change, even a 1-bit change to the message will produce a very different hash value. And three, that it's infeasible to find two messages that produce the same hash value. Some common hash functions, it's called MD5 or message digest number 5. This was invented by Ron Rivest, the R of RSA. All of these except for SHA-256 and SHA-512 and some of the higher versions of RIPEN have been compromised. People have found attacks. Basically, they've been able to find two messages that produce the same digest. And with hash functions, you have to be aware of the birthday attack. Anybody know what the birthday attack is here? One person. So basically what that means is in this group here, the odds of two people having the same birthday are extremely high, or over 70%. So when you're talking about hashes, you have to be aware that, that's a way of producing collisions, or finding two messages that produce the same hash value. A little bit of history. It goes way, way, way back. Okay? Egyptians in the Middle East, they found a clay table that was protecting some recipe for ceramic glaze. Greeks use this as a skitally, I think that's how you pronounce it. Basically, you wrap something around a pole and you write the message. If you don't have the right diameter, then you can't decrypt the message. And the Romans use what's referred to the Caesar cipher. Basically, you shift the alphabet. So when you have an A, you write a D, and so forth. And if you're a Unix person, ROT13 is basically a Caesar cipher. So sort of the modern era of cryptography started around the Second World War, where the Germans used a machine called an Enigma. This here is an Enigma, and then they have a variation called a RANS. The UK established a secret facility in what's called Bletchley Park that was designed specifically to break these algorithms. That led to the development of Colossus, which was the first programmable digital computer. And if you've heard of Alan Turing, he was one of their famous cryptographers or cryptanalysts there. In 1975, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, published what they call the data encryption algorithm, which was an algorithm invented by IBM. Originally, it was a 64-bit key, but for unknown reasons, it got reduced to 56-bit key. In 1976, Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman published this article called New Directions in Cryptography, which basically defined the first sort of public key system. It's also known DH or Diffie-Hellman. They had a patent that actually included Ralph Merkle. He sort of got the short end of the stick because he was, the concepts he's the one that originally came up with, but he didn't get the credit. It's only recent years that he's been given credit for this algorithm. A year later, 3 professors at MIT published released the RSA public algorithm. This was a true encryption because with Diffie-Hellman, it was used to exchange a secret key, and then you use the secret key to encrypt your data. With RSA, you could actually encrypt the data. And then in the 1990s, the GCHQ, sort of equivalent of the NSA in the UK, unclassified some documents that showed that they had actually known about these algorithms in the 60s. In 1985, 2 mathematicians, Koblitz and Miller, independently describe a new algorithm based on elliptic curves. And originally, it was very similar to Diffie-Hellman. You used it to exchange a secret key, although people have adapted them to actually do encryption. In 1993, the NIST publishes the digital signature standard, again, for doing digital signatures, and it used an algorithm called digital signature algorithm, or DSA, and a hashing function called secure hash algorithm. Right after they published it, someone found a weakness, so then they republished it, what's known now as SHA-1. That's why there's a 1. Then 2001, NIST publishes the Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES. They went through this whole process where it was made public throughout the world. And originally they started with, they picked 20 algorithms, and it slowly got filtered down until they finally ended up with what they call AES, which was based on some Dutch cryptographers, I forget their first names, but they combined it to call it the Rindell. And one of the criteria was that they wanted it to be easy to implement in hardware and software. And last point here is modern cryptography is based on very advanced mathematics. I'm not a mathematician, so a lot of these concepts I don't understand. I just try to use it the correct way. But if you like math, it's a good field to enter. So let's talk about what encryption and decryption is. So encryption is you have some sort of encryption function. You put in the plain text, you put in an encryption key, and out comes the ciphertext. And you want to do this in a secure environment. And the ciphertext can be in an unsecure environment, so you can send it over the internet or deliver it by mail or whatever you want. Decryption is basically the reverse, right? You receive the ciphertext, and then you pass it through a decryption function using a decryption key, and out comes the plain text. Some miscellaneous facts. Ideally, a key, or if it's a public key, a key pair should only be used for either confidentiality or authentication. Keys should have some sort of duration or lifetime. And encryption really should be used with integrity. And one of the references I'll give you to this mailing list. This was just published this morning. This is a cryptographer. His name is Philip Hallam Baker. And he said the heart of cryptography is integrity and not confidentiality. So what are some of the characteristics of encryption algorithms? So for secret key or symmetric key, which were the first types that were developed, the key used to encrypt is the same key used to decrypt. So ideally, only the authorized parties have access to that key, which means you have a key distribution problem. So if I want to communicate with you and with him, then if he has the same key we do, then he can read our messages. So that means I have to have a key for every party I want to communicate with. And how do I get the key to him or to him? Some of the common algorithms that are out there are DES, which is, was published by NIST. There was an enhancement that's called triple DES, where you get, basically it's a 112-bit key, you get 2 DES keys. And, well, you can either get 2 or 3. You encrypt with 1 key, decrypt with the 2nd key, and then encrypt with either the 1st key again or the 3rd key. That actually only gives you slightly better security than the regular encryption. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. AES, like I said, RC4 was another algorithm invented by the R in RSA. And you'll see around there something called blowfish and twofish, and like I mentioned, ROT13 on Linux. And symmetric key algorithms are divided into either block ciphers or stream ciphers. So block cipher basically works on blocks of data, generally 64-bit to 128-bit blocks, which means that if you're sending a 1-byte message, that it's going to be expanded to either 64 or 128 bits. So you have to account for that the message, the ciphertext can be larger than the plain text. Stream ciphers generally either work on a 1-bit stream or 8-bit streams. And then for block ciphers, there's what's called these modes. The simplest one is what's called electronic code book. So originally, one of the ways that the military used to encode information is by using a code book. So they would print some book that basically gave you a phrase and what it meant, and that was distributed to the authorized parties. And so this is basically that, logically equivalent. So you get a plain text, you get a key, and you encrypt it, and out comes a ciphertext. The trouble with electronic code book is the same data produces the same ciphertext. So there's a form of cryptanalysis that looks at frequency of letters and that. So this is very prone to that type of attack. An improvement on that is what's called cipher block chaining, where the plain text block is exclusive OR with the previous ciphertext block. Now you have the problem of the first plain text. What do you exclusive OR it? So that's called an initialization vector. That's generally a random number that you generate, and it can be sent with the message. So if you're using CBC, you have the problem of not only that your message may be bigger, your ciphertext may be bigger than your plain text, but also you have to send the IV. And there's different ways of converting a block cipher into a stream cipher, generally for, doing byte at a time. Obviously, this is going to be slower because you're processing, let's say with DES 64 bits to encrypt 8 bits. Public key algorithms are, like I said, something that just was invented in the late 70s. In this case, the encryption key, or what's known as the public key, is not the same as the private key. So with public key algorithm, the private key is treated just like the secret key in symmetric algorithms. So you have to keep that private. The public key can, generally, you want it to be public by definition. And it sort of solves the key distribution problem because you can say, hey, this is my public key, okay? The trouble is, how do you know that it's really my public key and not someone else's? One of the points I make later is trust is not binary. We look at the way cryptography is used a lot. They sort of try to make trust as a binary, yes or no, right? You guys sort of trust that I'm Aram Perez because I said so, but no one's verified my ID, And, humans, we treat trust very differently, right? I trust that I'm going to be safe here, driving, I trust the people is going to respect the red light, but that's not always the case. So public key has this problem of, how do I know that key really belongs to Alice or belongs to Bob? So this is one of the only case really where you can combine different algorithms to get better security. And basically what you do is you generate a secret key, use that to encrypt your bulk data. One thing I forgot to mention is public key algorithms are relatively slow compared to symmetric key, partly because they are based on this advanced mathematics and large numbers. Computers aren't good at multiplying or dividing large numbers. So once you have that secret key, you encrypt the data, and then you use the public key encryption to encrypt that secret key. So you're only encrypting a small amount of data, and you only have to do that once. So now you can send the encrypted data, the ciphertext of your message, along with the ciphertext of your secret key, and the receiving party can reverse that. Let's talk about digital signatures and certificates. Let's see how I'm doing on time. So as I mentioned earlier, a digital certificate is a mechanism designed to provide both authentication and message integrity. The most common algorithms are RSA, DSA, and CDSA, which is based on elliptic curves. So this is how you generate a digital signature. You take your message, you pass it through this hashing function, out comes the hash, and you go through a generation function using the private key. And then you get basically the digital signature, and then you combine and you send both the message and the digital signature. Okay. In this case, you're not worried about the confidentiality of the message. There are cases where you do worry, but for now, at a high level, you're not worried about the confidentiality of the message. With RSA and only with RSA is this signature generation function the same as the RSA encrypting function. With these other algorithms, it is not. Again, they use some advanced mathematics to come up with the digital signature, but it's not considered encrypting. To verify, you get the message and the digital signature. You separate the digital signature, pass it to the verification function. Using the public key, that outputs a hash. You take the message, you pass it through the hashing function, which means the sender and the receiver have to agree on that hashing function. And then you compare the hash values. If they're equal, that means the signature verified. If they're not equal, either the wrong public key was used, private key was used, or the message got tampered in transit. Again, with RSA, the verification function is the decrypting. DSA and DCSA again have some different algorithm that's not called decryption. If I can quote myself, when you verify a digital signature, you only know two things. Again, assuming the algorithms were not broken, is that the data wasn't modified and the corresponding private key was used. This goes back to trust. Trust is not binary, so you keep that aware that that's the only things you can do. Because a lot of modern cryptography is based on mathematicians. Mathematicians are used to saying, A plus B equals C, and that's true no matter what. In the real world, things don't work that way. So a digital certificate is basically a public key that has been signed by a trusted third party. And it can include other information such as your name, email, address, company you work for. And there's basically two popular formats. One's called X509, which comes from International Telecommunications Union. And the other one is PGP, which someone asked about if we were going to have a key signing party here. That's where that comes from. And XML SIG, again, someone designed a signature scheme or format for signing XML, which is a bare, anyway. In X509, this trusted third party is called a certificate authority. And that means that you have to have what's called the root key or root certificate, and you have to trust that. Now, that root key can be public, but it has to be integrity protected. One of my surprises, I don't know why it hasn't happened before. People download browsers. They have a bunch of root certificates in there. If you're downloading something, I don't know how you protect someone putting in a bad certificate or saying, this is VeriSign's certificate. If you can do that, you can do a lot of bad things. For PGP, the trusted third party is anyone you want to trust, and hence these key signing parties. where you get together with a bunch of friends and you sign each other's keys. The problem with that is, if I'm in California and you're here, how do we get that together to do that? Issues with certificates, whether they're X509 or PGP, they generally have some sort of expiration. And how do you revoke? If you know a key got compromised, how do you let everybody else know that happened? In X509, they developed, what's called certificate revocation lists, or CRLs. The trouble with these is, a certificate authority isn't publishing these every 5 minutes. So you can sort of only trust the keys that aren't on there until the next CRL. So if a key you're trusting appears in the next CRL, you don't know when the compromise occurred. Someone tried to get a little bit more real time, came up with what's called the online certificate status protocol, where you can send a message to what's called an OCSP responder and ask them, is this key valid? Some people made a lot of money making one of these, but in the real world it hasn't panned out. Yes. Yes, I mean, there's been a couple of issues with both of these. I mean that, either the browser didn't check these correctly or didn't check them at all. Right. So I'll just talk a little bit high level, different types of attacks. So the easiest one is eavesdropping, where you have your attackers named Eve, so beware of pretty looking girls. Generally, Eve doesn't care in real time. What she's going to do is going to record the conversation, then work on it later, try to break it. There's Manny. I don't know if you can see here. Here, the man in the middle. A man-in-the-middle attack, generally, you're trying to be an active participant in the conversation between Alice and Bob. You're trying to make Alice think he's talking to Bob when in reality she's talking to Manny, and on the other side Bob thinks he's talking to Alice, but he's really talking to Manny. Yes. Right. And there's been several occasions where, well, Symantec bought VeriSign. So VeriSign was the original big certificate authority. They were spun off from RSA Data Security. But yeah, they were fooled into issuing a false Microsoft certificate, and there's been at several CAs that and this sort of illustrates the trusted public key issue. If you read the paper from Diffie-Hellman, they envisioned a phone book. This was back in the 70s. The internet didn't exist. Cell phones didn't exist. Everybody had, if you wanted to call someone, you would go to the yellow pages, look up their number, and call them. So they envisioned something similar to that. I forgot to put the name of the guy that came up with the concept of certificates. Was his PhD thesis. He's the one that introduced using certificates. But if Alice thinks she's talking to Bob and she sends him the certificate, her public key without any protection, Manny can get it, send his public key to Bob, and now Bob doesn't know that Manny's sitting in between. Brute force is the other major type of attack where for symmetric key, you're basically trying every possible combination of key. So the strength of your security depends on the size of that key. Generally, it's, your key space is 2 to the n. DES actually has what's called weak keys and pseudo-weak keys. So, it's like 2 to the 56 minus 8 or 10, something like that. Still, it's still over 72 quadrillion different keys. But, some machines have already been built. This was early, I think toward the end of the century, that will break a key, a DES key, in just over 22 hours. Now, the security of this is that you have a random key that's uniformly distributed. Any of you gamble here? All right? Odds are against you, but people still gamble, and some people still win. All right? So when you're building a machine like this, you can be lucky and hit it, in the first minute. But, security is just overall. And basically, brute force for public key algorithms is basically you have to solve these hard mathematical problems. For RSA, it's what's called the integer factorization. RSA uses 2 prime numbers, and you have to factor them, and they're modulo. So everybody know what's modulo? Your watch, right? It's, let's see here. Well, we started at, if I start at meeting at 11 and it goes for 2 hours, it doesn't finish at 1300 unless you're in the military, it finishes at 1. So it's because our time is based on a modular 12. And then with Diffie-Hellman and elliptic curve, you have to solve what's called a discrete logarithm problem. And sort of the recent development in attacks is what's called side channels. There's a company started by Paul Kocher, who was the inventor of the original version of SSL, where they took a smart card that used DES, and they measured the power. And by causing the smart card to decrypt something and measuring the power used, they were able to figure out the keys. And they expanded it to what's called differential power. It's a little bit more complex, but works better. And there's been a number of attacks by using timing. If you look at RSA, RSA uses multiplication and a sort of a naive implementation. You're multiplying 2 numbers and you're doing it 1 bit at a time. If you have a 0, the answer is 0. So why go through the multiplication? So a naive implementation will do that, and so you can tell how long these loops take, and the shorter ones mean they skipped multiplication by 0. And there's ways, again, of mitigating these, and Well, I like to call these guys sort of the mafia of crypto because they developed and patented some methods to prevent these attacks. And so if you have a smart card, you had to pay them, royalties to use their algorithms, their protection. So some do's and don'ts. Always use a standardized and well-known algorithm. Nowadays, you want to use triple DES, AES, RSA, elliptic curve, and at minimum SHA-2 or above. There's SHA-256 and SHA-512. If you can, try to have two different keys, one for authentication, one for authentication, the other for confidentiality. It's very critical that you use good random number generators. Remember, a computer really can't generate a random number. They're pseudo-random numbers. Okay? There's been a number of attacks. One of the first attacks against SSL was because the guys at Mozilla did a poor job with seeding the random number generator. Someone figured out what they were doing and was able to crack keys fairly easy. Use, like if you're on Linux, there's the /dev random, or I forget, there's two of them there. Okay. Okay. Someone else had a question? Oh, sure. Okay. If you're writing your own code, be sure and review it carefully. Remember, if you're using C and you malloc some space for a key, and then you free it, that key is still there. So you need special free functions. Same thing in Java. Java has their own special sort of memory functions for crypto. Remember, there's a difference between authentication and authorization. Okay? My license gives me permission to drive a car, even though if I go to a bar, and I'm old enough now that they won't ask me, but a lot of you here are young enough, they'll ask you if you want to buy a beer, they're going to ask you for your ID. Your ID doesn't give you permission to drink, okay? But people confuse authentication and authorization. And your security is only as strong as your weakest link or your weakest key. CAs have been compromised. They have issued bad keys or bad certificates. Nowadays, your keys for symmetric should be at least 128 bits. Remember, trust but verify. And trust is not binary. Don't try to invent your own algorithm. Okay? Anybody play DVDs on their Linux machine? Technically, yes. Okay? Why did that happen? Because they thought they could invent a better, secure algorithm that they didn't put out there to be studied by cryptographers, people that make a living. And some kid, I think it was 13 years old, was able to reverse engineer the algorithm and publish it, okay? Again, random numbers, if you use a weak, it's going to cause problems. Don't think of using like DES and then AES together. Some strange interactions can happen. I can't tell you what they are because I'm not a cryptographer, but you can research, and there have been bad things happen because someone thought they would be smart and did that. And again, don't believe in security by obscurity. Questions? The mic. Am I that good? Use the mic, please. It's right here.
Where do you see it heading?
I'll make these slides available, and further down, and in the little bio here, I mentioned I've pivoted from security. I've worked in security for a long time, and it's sort of like viruses on your PC. This is a never-ending battle. There's going to be more attacks. There's going to be people, getting around or coming up with a new algorithm. One of the things I didn't mention here is what's called quantum encryption. In theory, a quantum computer will solve DES or AES almost immediately. But no one's built, 128-bit quantum or qubit quantum computer yet. People will come up with new algorithms. Again, if someone publishes a brand new algorithm and it hasn't been studied, like the AES that went for at least 5 years, don't use it. You want things that experts have studied and tried to break. I don't know, is that another question here?
A lot of us being software developers, in your experience, what's the best way to store your private keys?
There's no easy answer. Ideally in hardware, some sort of hardware, but you always have the issue of how do you connect that hardware so that your software can use that key. If you're storing it on your computer, there's some standards for encrypting a key using a password. One of those, I forgot the acronym. If you give me your name, I can look up the functions and give you what those are. But there's functions that there's standardized ways of taking a password or passphrase from the user and using that to encrypt or decrypt that's stored on your computer. But ideally, you have some sort of dongle that you connect to your mic.
You talked about hardware. What about is there any advances in being able to trust hardware and that level of ensuring that the hardware is what it's supposed to be?
Right. So there's a interesting book, and I forgot the name about it. One of the newest advances on making chips is basically layering them. So some guy wrote a book, and again, if you give me your name, I'll find the name of the book, where he talks about some foreign country where they make a lot of chips, got into this process and stuck in their own layer, and it allowed that, you know, if you knew the special command you could send, and he used cell phones, so at a certain time he killed all cell phones because, you know, he was able, or, you know, the bad guys were able to put in a layer that they controlled. You know, with enough time and money, well, actually, most universities nowadays have the equipment to peel off a chip layer by layer and reverse engineer the chip. If you're storing your key on there, depending on what technology you're using, you can figure out the key. Mike, take that. But in order to fry, so to repeat the comment, some people use a copper mesh to protect, but that means you have to have power. So if you don't have power, you know, then yes, yes. So let's go to, you know, Google's your friend. Wikipedia has some good articles. There's a mailing list. I subscribed so long ago, I don't remember how I did it, but it's cryptography@metsdao.com. So if you want to read some heavy-duty stuff and discussions, subscribe to that. It's been a pleasure, and if you want any more information, I can give you my card, and thank you.